There's a part of the Eucharistic prayer we're using this season that I just absolutely love. You know, the Eucharistic prayer where the priest gets up here behind the altar and he asks God to bless the bread and the wine that we use for communion. Well, there's a part of that prayer where we give thanks and praise to God for coming to earth and entering time in Jesus. And the part that I really love goes like this, and it's about Jesus. It reads, "For his life which informs our living, for his compassion which changes our hearts, for his clear speaking which contradicts our harmless generalities, for his disturbing presence, his innocent suffering, his fearless dying, and his rising to life, breathing forgiveness." It's a beautiful prayer. And I especially like that part about his disturbing presence. I don't think we often think of Jesus' presence as disturbing. We might think of it as loving and caring and compassionate. But this morning's gospel lesson presents us with a Jesus who creates conflict. That's not something new to Mark's gospel. The very first lines in his gospel, Jesus tells his readers that this good news of Jesus Christ is ushering in a new regime. Jesus is ushering in the kingdom of God that is about to change everything. And in this morning's gospel lesson, we get a glimpse of Jesus' disturbing presence that disturbs those systems and the practices of our lives and our communities that prevent us from living into the kingdom of God. Now, so much of the conflicts in this morning's gospel lesson and this morning's story focus around the Sabbath. The Sabbath was and is a deeply important practice for Jewish communities. It's the day of rest that's tied to holiness and the goodness of creation and liberation from captivity and slavery. It's intended to provide order to life, to create the circumstances that are necessary and that enable people to live into God's holiness and blessing. It's intended, as Jesus reminds us today, for human beings, to remind us that our lives belong to God and not to our labor and our work. The proper function of the Sabbath is to promote human life and well-being. But in this morning's story, Jesus seems to think that for those religious authorities, their practices and their rituals had become so sacred to them and so important to them, more important than God's original intention for the Sabbath. And in plucking grain with his disciples as they're wandering through a grain field, and in healing a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath, Jesus demonstrates that the Sabbath should not get in the way of greater human need. The Sabbath should not be creating burdens for human lives. It should not deny the feeding of the hungry and healing for the sick. Now, I think it's important to point out that Jesus' interpretation of the Sabbath law wasn't something new. It wasn't some radical or completely scandalized interpretation of the Sabbath law. There was rabbinic tradition dating all the way back to the first century, the time of Jesus, that had a similar opinion to Jesus about what the Sabbath was intended for, to promote human life. And these Pharisees, these religious leaders who knew the ins and outs of the Sabbath law and who were familiar with the different interpretations of them, wouldn't have been surprised or shocked to hear Jesus' interpretation of this Sabbath law. But perhaps what did upset them was this nobody, uppity teacher who compared himself to King David and who claimed to be Lord of the Sabbath. This nobody, uppity teacher who challenged their rituals and their traditions that he saw as eclipsing God's original intention for the Sabbath. It's very interesting to think about it that way. And it's ironic that at the very end of this morning's lesson, it's those religious leaders who actually violate the Sabbath law by going out and seeking to destroy Jesus and seeking to do harm to human life. Now, in the midst of the conflicts that this morning's story highlights, Jesus has an important message not only for the religious leaders, but also for us. It's important for us to understand that this morning's story is not just about how when pressing needs permit us to break rules or to violate laws. Jesus and his disciples were hungry, but they weren't necessarily starving. And Jesus could have very well healed the man with the withered hand at sundown when it was no longer considered to be Sabbath. But in doing what he did, and when he did it, Jesus has a point to prove. He reminds us that our practices and habits should be opening our hearts, not closing them off to the needs of the people around us and the beauty that surrounds us. Our practices should be opening our hearts. And I have to admit, sometimes I am the worst at this. I, for example, am terrible at relaxing. My wife just last week dragged me to the beach with her, and I didn't bring any work with me. I didn't bring anything to make me feel productive, and we just sat there in the sand, and to be honest, it drove me a little bit crazy. I started to twitch a little bit. I can get so preoccupied and so lost in thinking that I need to be productive that I'm not open to the people around me. And I think in our efforts to do what we think is right, we can sometimes get so focused to what's immediately in front of us or the minute and minuscule, and we're not open to the bigger picture around us. I like the way the Avett Brothers say it. They're a folk band from North Carolina, and they have a song that has some lyrics that go like this. I hope that I don't sound too insane when I say there's darkness all around us. I don't feel weak, but I do need sometimes for her to protect me and reconnect me to the beauty that I'm missing. To reconnect me to the beauty that I'm missing. Jesus doesn't disturb or disrupt our lives just to be disruptive. Jesus wants us to change our habits and our practices so that we can be transformed. And transformation sounds nice, but boy, is it hard. I know that when I go through change and transformation, I want that change and transformation to be on my terms. I want to initiate that change and transformation. But I know a priest who once said, luckily for us, God doesn't operate that way. God operates on God's terms, not ours. And God operates in a mode of complete generosity and love. And day by day by day, God invites us into that complete generosity and love, to be transformed in ways that open us up to God's compassion and joy that surrounds us. And our job in the midst of all of this is simply to pay attention to Jesus, who is working to open our hearts. So, I think it's worthwhile to ask ourselves, what fields is Jesus walking through in our lives, plucking grain from those rituals and practices that we have put up and that are so sacred and important to us, but that prevent us from addressing the human need and suffering in our lives, in our communities? What is Jesus disrupting or disturbing in our lives that more fully open us up to the God's goodness and joy and compassion meant for all people? How are we being transformed by Jesus' presence that is working to reconnect us to the beauty that we're missing. Amen.